Humans are inherently fallible creatures. We're constantly making mistakes that, in an ideal scenario, can eventually lead us into making the right calls in the future. Games are much the same. You can see what previous titles have done right and wrong to adapt and build up a hopefully stronger game down the line. However, while some mishaps can be written off as just small goofs that don't really matter too much in the grand scheme of things, others can end up having dire consequences down the line, with them also having the potential to be comedic masterpieces if the mistake in question is so colossally dumb that even without the benefit of hindsight, it's borderline unbelievable that someone could even cock things up that badly. So, in honor of that idea, let's take a look at some games that ended up being completely stripped from store shelves thanks to the efforts of some immaculately boneheaded moves. These are the stupid mistakes that got games recalled. I'm sure most people watching this have played, or at least are aware of what a Mario Party is. So for both of our sakes, I'm not going to waste time explaining what the series is and its general history. For our purposes, we're interested in the series debut on the Wii with 2007's Mario Party 8. More specifically, the game's UK release, which on top of getting delayed by a month from its original release date of the 19th of June to 13th of July due to production issues, ended up getting recalled almost immediately after it came out, with Nintendo explaining that due to an assembly error, some copies accidentally featured the wrong version of the disc. Namely, they featured the English translation from the American version of the title. Now you might be questioning, why exactly would that be a problem when both the UK and US speak the same language? Realistically, outside of some minor spelling differences, this shouldn't really be a big issue. Well, this ended up being a case where words between regions that speak the same language have very different connotations. The issue in question can be found on the game's fourth board, Shy Guy's Perplex Express, which has players run through and on top of a train to buy stars from the Shy Guy conductor. One of the events that can happen on the board is Magic Koopa showing up to transport the carriage at the front of the train to the back, and it's what he says beforehand that caused the recall. The line in the American release being, "Magic Koopa magic, turn the train blank, make this ticket tragic." If you're wondering why I said blank in place of the actual word, that's because whilst in the US it's more often taken as a descriptive word for clumsy and foolish behaviour, in the UK it is one of, if not the most offensive ableist slur you could possibly use, specifically referring to people who suffer from cerebral palsy, a group of movement disorders brought about due to abnormal development or damage to parts of the brain that control movement, balance, and posture. Needless to say, this would not have gone down well if it wasn't changed. So for the European release, the line was altered to "turn the train erratic", with the UK retailer Game being the ones who confirmed that the issue was specifically this line remaining unaltered in some early copies of the game. Later US releases of Mario Party 8 would change the line altogether to "let me use my magic to make this all a little more interesting", with the incident also being cited as one of the reasons why several Nintendo games that came out afterwards would have both an American English and a British English translation, as opposed to just copying over the American text for all regions. Whilst we don't know what exactly went wrong during the assembling process that caused the original US script to be put on by accident, it's pretty wild to me that the possibility of accidentally releasing the script that had a slur in it was even a possibility. It makes you question how a company who at this point have been making and selling video games for over 2 decades could even make an error this bad. Then again, the American branch of Nintendo isn't perfect either. For example, they initially turned down bringing over Xenoblade. I'm sure that's on par with a Mario character making fun of the disabled. The PGA Tour series is one of EA's many sports franchises that saw annual releases from 1994 to 2013, with a handful of games also coming out both before and afterwards, it effectively being the golf counterpart to their FIFA and Madden franchises, with the majority of the games having famed golf player Tiger Woods as the face of the series. Now don't worry, this story has nothing to do with golf or the life of Mr. Woods, which is good because I can't think of anything I'd like to talk about less than celeb gossip and the most boring sport known to man. The specific game that got recalled was, coincidentally, the first game that had Tiger as the star, with Tiger Woods' 99 PGA Tour, specifically the home console version for the original PlayStation. Now, you won't be able to find why this happened just by playing the game. Instead, you'll need to put the disc into a computer's CD drive where you can see all of the game's files. Normally there's nothing too out of the ordinary, but if you happen to own one of the first 100,000 copies of the game to be printed, you would find a hidden QuickTime Media Player file called zzDummy.dat, which when played reveals a recording of an animated short from 1995 called The Spirit of Christmas. But if this looks remotely familiar at all, that's because this short was made by Matt Stone and Trey Parker, otherwise known as the guys who created South Park, with this short being retroactively seen as a sort of unofficial pilot for the series. In fact, back in 1992, they actually made a different short also called The Spirit of Christmas, though to help distinguish them more easily, the 92 short is often called Jesus vs. Frosty, with the 95 one being Jesus vs. Santa. As for why the short is even on the disc, well, this is the result of the video being a test for making dummy files, a type of file that is used to fill up empty space on a disk so that more important files can be stored closer to the disk's edge and in turn loaded faster, that the dev team just forgot to remove or replace with a different dummy file before the game went gold. EA would eventually end up recalling the game a few months later when the file's inclusions started getting spread around after a kid in Florida managed to find it, whose mother then called into a local radio show to talk about it, with EA later re-releasing the game with the file removed, along with publicly calling the short objectionable content to consumers. Though whether they actually cared about that and instead only wanted to remove it to avoid potential issues with ESRB, Tiger Woods, and Comedy Central, I'll let you decide. In 1990, Sega released Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, a 2D platformer which sees Disney's beloved rodent having to explore his way through the titular castle to save Minnie from an evil witch called Mizrabel, along the way needing to find the 7 gems of the rainbow to defeat her. The game ended up being very positively received. In fact, it's probably a candidate for one of the system's best platformers prior to the existence of a certain hedgehog, with it eventually seeing an 8-bit conversion for both the Game Gear and Master System, as well as various sequels, the first to come out being 1992's Land of Illusion. However, between both of those games, there was actually one other Sega-published Mickey Mouse game, which was initially reported as a Castle of of Illusion sequel, but instead of being an original game that just happened to have Mickey as the main character, this one was going to be based on one of the mouse's most iconic appearances, with a game based on the 1940 animated film Fantasia, Disney giving the green light for it based on both the success of Castle of Illusion and to cash in on the movie's 50th anniversary. However, unlike Castle of Illusion, which was developed in-house by Sega, they would only be handling publishing duties this time around, with development being outsourced to the studio Infogrames, who you might know as the company that would eventually buy and then rebrand themselves as Atari. Now, that alone isn't enough to say it would be a downgrade, but maybe the fact it was rushed out for the holiday season and that it was made by a team of 6 people who had no experience making console games? Yeah, from that information, this game is going to be pretty shit, isn't it? Unsurprisingly, people didn't and still don't like this game, with its poor gameplay, lack of polish, and absolute butchering of the original film's score, leading to people generally labeling it as both one of the worst Mega Drive games and worst Sega games in general. Eventually, word of this got back to Roy E. Disney, the nephew of Walt Disney, who at the time was the chairman of their animation department and vice chairman of the entire company, who was not happy with this, not only because of the game's poor quality, but apparently whoever was responsible for giving Sega the rights to make it didn't know that Roy had promised Walt that the company would never license out Fantasia, meaning this went from a bad game to a bad game that the top execs would never have greenlit the existence of in the first place, with Roy immediately demanding the game stop being sold, all ads for it to be pulled, and for the roughly 5,000 unsold copies still in circulation to be destroyed. Luckily, this didn't seem to affect Sega's relationship with Disney too much, thanks to the much better Illusion sequels that came out later, though I'm pretty sure whoever gave them the Fantasia license was skinned alive. My evidence for this is that it's Disney. They've done far worse. Alright, this one is a fairly well-known story by this point, but it's just too insane of a situation to not talk about it. Now, whilst this game didn't release until 2008, our story starts in 1996, when developer Silicon Knights, who had made a handful of games before for DOS and Sega Saturn, released the title that would become their initial claim to fame, Blood Omen: Legacy of Kain, which would end up being the first in a series of 5 games. However, SK would only be involved in the first entry, despite their efforts to sue the game's publisher and developer for the sequels, Crystal Dynamics, for ownership of the series, along with also trying to stop the release of the first sequel, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, under claims that Crystal had stolen their concepts for a potential Kain 2. Long story short, the case was settled out of court, Crystal Dynamics still own the rights to the Legacy of Kain series to this day, and it later turned out the ideas for Soul Reaver had literally nothing to do with what Silicon Knights had come up with, as the game started as an original title called Shifter that was turned into a sequel to Blood Omen later on. Despite losing their efforts to take control of the Legacy of Kain series, Silicon Knights were unperturbed, and at E3 1999, they announced their next game titled Too Human, which was set to release for the original PlayStation. However, this would soon shift to being a GameCube exclusive, when the studio managed to partner up with Nintendo in 2000. Before being put on hold so that they could focus development on 2002's Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, a psychological horror game which would end up being the first Nintendo-published title to receive an M rating, and the 2004 remake of the original Metal Gear Solid, subtitled The Twin Snakes. Two Humans development would then resume in 2005, with Silicon Knights leaving Nintendo for Microsoft, the game now being slated to release for the Xbox 360, and it was to be made using Epic Games' Unreal Engine, specifically Unreal 3, which Epic would develop and update as they worked on the original Gears of War, with them being so confident in the game's success that they had already planned out to make it a trilogy. Despite how at this point events should have played out fairly normally up to the game's release, just 1 year prior, in July 2007, Silicon Knights would attempt to sue Epic Games for failing to provide a working engine, claiming that not only had they failed to deliver it on time, but that they were intentionally withholding information from developers licensing it in order to make their own games with the engine look better than the competition's, whilst using the money they were taking from licensees to develop games instead of the engine. Now, if publicly admitting that you thought your own game was so bad you had to sue the company you bought the engine from a year ahead of the game's release was bad enough, just a month later, Epic Games would counter-sue Silicon Knights, as not only did they know well ahead of time that Unreal 3 would still be in development by the time it was given to them, but it turns out that the new engine they had built for Two Human in the meantime was made up of stolen Unreal 3 code, with the theft being incredibly obvious as they were apparently so haphazard with their code theft that they left in non-functional internal comments between Epic Games developers, with the only real edits being to remove Epic's copyright notices. You heard me right. Silicon Knights not only sued Epic for breaking promises they didn't make, they sued them whilst actively and blatantly stealing from them. Eventually, in 2012, the courts would ultimately rule in Epic's favour, because why the hell wouldn't they? With Silicon Knights being forced to pay out $4.45 million for copyright infringement, misappropriation of trade secrets, and breach of contract. With that figure then being doubled to cover the pre-judgment interest and attorney fees, along with having to destroy any remnants they had of both any derivative code of Unreal 3 and any information from the licensee restricted areas of the Unreal Engine documentation website. And then for the final cherry on top, they were forced to recall and destroy any unsold retail copies of games they had made using Unreal 3, which in addition to Two Human included X-Men Destiny and 3 other projects that hadn't even been released or even announced yet, with all of this ultimately leading to Silicon Knights going defunct in 2014. The 2 planned sequels were also cancelled, along with getting delisted from the Xbox store. Oddly enough, in 2019, not only would the game return there, with it now being completely free, but it was also made backwards compatible for the Xbox One, meaning you could actually play this game right now if you're curious about it and own an Xbox. I should mention the game got pretty mediocre reviews, the only points of praise being the game's setting of a sci-fi themed spin of Norse mythology, and the story. You know, barring the cliffhanger ending that's never going to get resolved, with basically everything else being just okay or bad. Well, now that we've gone through our stories for the day, let's end things off by just quickly recapping what we've learned. Make sure you don't accidentally include ableist slurs in your games, don't include mature content in material that can be bought by kids, don't give out the license to stuff one of your bosses specifically promised to never license out, and don't sue companies you are actively stealing from. I would say these things should go without saying, but as we've clearly seen, they evidently do not. Anyway, just keep all of that in mind, and maybe someday you too will also have the intelligence needed to successfully compete in Buzz the School's quiz. Did you know this game had official help from the UK government? I don't know what to do with this information, so now you have it as well.